Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Corcione, partner at HKA's Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice, here to talk to you today about some pretty important topics in the cyberspace, really focused a lot on the regulatory environment. We're very fortunate today to have three fantastic professionals, two that have previously worked with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and my good friend and partner, Christopher Bender, who's worked on a lot of regulatory enforcement work, some with myself and quite a few over his career, and talk to you today a little bit about the cyber threat landscape, cyber risks. Going to be a keen focus on regulatory risk, things that are driving out of the recent cycle we had of emerging regulations in cybersecurity and privacy, for that matter, and how firms protect data, how they report on breaches, and really come into a cycle now where there'll be enforcement. People have a good understanding of what needed to be implemented. The regulators have given time and have expectations. Firms have put these controls in place in their programs. And so now the scrutiny will come in, and hope to share some insights today with these great professionals and moderate this panel and give some insights on what firms maybe have to look out for as they have regulatory exams and other scrutiny coming in. So let me pass over for some quick introductions. I guess we'll just go in order down the slide. Chris Hetner, if you could give a brief intro to the crowd, please.
Yeah, sure, Mike. Nice to be with everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on the time zone. Chris Hetner here. I served as the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor to the Chair's Office of the SEC, helped to build out their cyber exam program, spent about 25 years in cybersecurity prior to that, and currently serving as a strategic advisor to HKA and Mike's practice overall, helping the HKA family and their clients think about SEC examination readiness from a cyber perspective, but also aligning their cyber risk capabilities into the boardroom and creating more strength around governance and risk management practices. So happy to be here with everyone.
Great, thanks. And I guess we'll go to the other Chris, Mr. Bender.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here with you today. My name is Chris Bender. I've been working in the security and privacy space for a little over 30 years, working primarily in the private sector area with trying to help folks balance some of their regulatory requirements with getting some of the business value out of it. Through that effort, I've worked a lot with regulators and working with multiple regulators to try to find some middle ground in how to do things properly and effectively to meet their requirements, but also to do things that make sense from a business standpoint and what makes sense from an investment standpoint. And so looking at how you create your controls and you do the things to protect your systems, but also trying to grow and making your business more effective, more efficient, more profitable, and all those things, and trying to figure out what that means on an ongoing basis, because what you start with in one day or 1 year is not what it looks like the next day or the next year. So it's an evolving process. So very excited to be part of the dialogue today.
Great, thanks, Chris. And our third candidate coming into the private sector recently from the SEC, Igor Rosenblit. Igor from Iron Road Partners, please give a little intro.
Sure. I'm a private equity guy. I started my career doing deals, direct deals, buyout, and mezzanine. I went on to run Credit Agricole's fund of funds program in the US, and then spent almost 11 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission, focused exclusively on private equity, private markets, and private funds. My first stint at the SEC was in the Division of Enforcement in the Asset Management Unit as their private equity industry expert. And then I founded and co-ran the Division of Exams Private Funds Unit. And now spun out and head up Iron Road Partners, which is a consultancy focused on compliance strategy, risk, and governance. And I think I'm here to really add some of the industry component to understanding cybersecurity and really understanding how the intersection of cybersecurity, regulations, and private equity should be handled and controlled in this ever-changing landscape.
Great, thanks, Igor. And you concluded with the word that I was going to go into next when we look at landscape. And in cyber, it's the threat landscape, right? And that's what makes this space different than traditional information security because you're looking at the threats, looking at the attacks. And what we've seen in the last several months is probably the most ominous threat landscape that we've ever seen. Attacks on Microsoft, SolarWinds, and Kaseya, much more complex and sophisticated than ones we've seen in the past, and far-reaching. Chris, you've done some work a lot in the last year or so with private equity firms that are looking to bolster these up. You've seen quite a few things out there. I know your team has done some response. What are you seeing in regards to the threat landscape and some of the emerging attacks that are coming out, really impacting firms the most?
Yeah, I think one of the big things out there right now is actually it's just volume. There's so much coming out and it's hitting all levels of the organization. And so it's that commonality or the weakest link type of thing that's one of the biggest threats out there. And as you mentioned, the sophistication of some of these threats is certainly growing, but a lot of the things that are actually causing trouble are not very sophisticated. And they are things that could be very easily taken care of and remediated. They're just hitting the right parts of the organization at the right times. And so the way that we need to look at some of these things is to look at them across the entire spectrum and figure out what can we do to make sure that we address some of those weaker links and make sure that we bolster those where needed. The activity that we've also seen has been targeting not your traditional targets. You mentioned some of the big names out there, but we've seen a lot of activity with smaller entities and people who have generally thought, for the most part, based on their size and their obscurity, they're relatively safe. And that hasn't been the case, especially over the past 2 years. And part of the situation with people working remotely, changing the way we do business around the COVID constraints that we've had with everything from interacting in offices and travel and all kind of things in that space are all factors that have contributed to it. But and I think we're going to see a lot of that continuing. You're going to see people trying to exploit and use tactics that are actually fairly unsophisticated and having some good success with it. And the cost for them to do that is not very high and the benefits are pretty decent. So we're going to see that volume at least staying or increasing as we go forward. And then some of the things that people need to think about, it's not so much if something can happen, it's when is something going to try to get you and how well prepared are you for it.
Great. And so Igor, the Securities and Exchange Commission looks to protect investors. The private equity firms manage assets that are targets. The SEC traditionally examines compliance reviews that you've done hundreds, if not thousands of in the past. You've seen certain trends recently that cyber now has emerged into the conversation directly with clients and from the view of the regulators. How are regulators, starting to add this into their oversight on some of the on the private equity firms, asset managers in general?
Well, I'd like to take it in two parts. From the regulator perspective, there are specialized units inside of the SEC focused on cybersecurity. There's one in the Division of Exams called the Technology Controls Program, which is a fairly robust group that all they do is examinations of cybersecurity practices at investment advisors and broker dealers. Enforcement also has a good capability to kind of understand and bring cases around cybersecurity incidents, which I think some of which we've seen. On the private equity side, I want to address kind of two kind of points that I think I might be overlooked by some firms. I know a lot of our clients, and when I was on the exam side, are really concerned about cybersecurity, but a lot of them think that, as Chris Bender mentioned, there's really nothing I can do there. The volume is so high, there is nothing I can do to stop a cybersecurity attack. So why even try? And the fact is that the Securities and Exchange Commission has put out a number of pieces discussing how compliance and policies and procedures should work at investment advisors. And it's one thing if a cybersecurity incident happens and all those policies and procedures are in place. And it's a totally different and much more severe situation if a cybersecurity incident happens and those policies and procedures are not in fact in place. And those two scenarios would play out very differently, with one possibly going to enforcement and with the other not. And so having policies and procedures in place, no matter what you think your chances are of being breached, is important. The other thing is there have been a lot of cases around not reporting incidents, cybersecurity incidents, and that's been primarily the focus and the thrust of the SEC. But there are some adjacent cases that I think people should be paying attention to. One, which got a lot of press but has absolutely nothing to do with cyber but is related, is a case called Cokerich, where there's a SPAC that failed to do due diligence on an acquisition target. And if you really pay attention to the case, it's really not about this target, acquisition target, lying about certain facts. It's the fact that this SPAC, which by the way acts very similarly to how private equity advisors act, failed to do due diligence on its target. And private equity firms that fail to do due diligence, cybersecurity due diligence on their portfolio companies, would likely fall into kind of the same legal theories and be subject to the same legal theories as this particular SPAC was. And the things to keep in mind is in 2018, there was a release issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission talking about the duty of loyalty and the duty of care. And doing due diligence on portfolio companies and sufficient due diligence on portfolio companies is clearly part of the duty of care framework that was set forth in 2018. And the other thing to think about is that investors are asking a lot about cybersecurity due diligence and cybersecurity policies and procedures at any particular manager. And so to the extent that you've told investors anything about the due diligence that you do on your portfolio companies or the policies and procedures that you have in place at your manager, it's really important to actually implement those because not implementing those would violate kind of a disclosure tenet of the SEC and also increase legal exposure for your firm. So in summary, focus on the portfolio companies, make sure the due diligence is reasonable. It doesn't have to be rock solid. And the same goes for the manager. What you do doesn't have to be impenetrable, but it has to be reasonably designed and it has to be reasonable.
It's very helpful, Igor. And Chris, Igor mentioned the TCP program. I know you're familiar there. I know you still stay in touch with a lot of your contacts in government, and really been on, discussions on how some of those exams are adjusting based on not only threats but self-reported incidents that are coming. Share a little bit about what you're seeing from your contacts in, Washington and other regulators how they collaborate in modifying exam approaches.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. The technology controls program within the Division of Exams is a targeted unit towards examining for cybersecurity, for technology controls in general. They're very much aligned to the Reg SCI entities, systems compliance integrity, as well as the core market utilities, self-regulatory organizations, exchanges, utilities. But in addition to that, core emphasis in terms of concentration risk, they're also bleeding into the investment advisors, the broker dealers. And one of the capabilities that we built back when I was in the exam program leading cybersecurity was this concept of how do you gather market trends, insights, threat intelligence, and bring that into the organization to inform their examination priorities. So that's very much a capability that's in place. And certainly the self-reported incidents that come through the commission are being placed on the desks of the examiners, and they're using these incidents as an opportunity to do targeted exams. There are also exams and heightened activity as a result of enforcement actions, what we call for cause exams. And basically, that core unit is really doubling down their focus. They're increasing their skill sets and their capabilities. They're tethered to law enforcement, the intelligence community association. So they really have the finger on the pulse as to what's going on. Now, one additional capability that's kind of unprecedented was the addition of an examiner with an enforcement unit. And the enforcement examiner focused on cybersecurity, risk management principles, and governance. So that's a signal that the enforcement divisions can be doubling down in their focus on ensuring that companies are complying and conforming to the various regulations, whether it be Reg SID, Reg SP, protecting personal identifiable information, customer information, as well as any enforcement actions around public company disclosures. And we've seen a kind of an array of enforcement actions coming from the Commission around these particular topics. So one added point, just as it relates to the trends we're seeing in the boardroom community and the investor community, to kind of piggyback off of Igor's point on preserving value. At the end of the day, cyber is beyond just a technology issue. We've seen the increased costs and implications across companies, ranging from intellectual property theft to performing type of damage on the company assets. In fact, this year, according to the World Economic Forum, we project by 2021, damages across the globe is going to be upward of $6 trillion as a result of cybercrime. So this is signaling to the market that this is real dollars and cents, euros, pounds, pick the currency. There's an impact now on your balance sheet, on your investments, and on the integrity of the company. So with that is a heightened focus on cyber risk governance, and the presence of these cybersecurity blind spots increases the risk of a fragmented cyberspace. And then you have competing technology regulations that also adds complexity. So it's incumbent upon the company to really gain that 360 view across where the risks are in the enterprise, but also understand those risks relative to these heightened regulatory expectations as it's being placed not only on the security organization and management, but also on the board of directors. And just in speaking to the boards and serving on a couple of boards and advising boards, we see, as this empirical threat to the global economy becomes more prevalent, organizations, business leaders, shareholders, regulators are expecting transparent and quantitative means for evaluating and understanding their cybersecurity exposure as it relates to their financial, their business, their operational conditions. So it's no longer simply an IT issue. It's relative to the integrity of their balance sheet, of their investments, of their growth strategy, and linking that two together has been a challenge. And we're seeing now, the regulators and the boards starting to drive that requirement more closely, particularly as you're expected to demonstrate due care in terms of how you exercise your governance and oversight of cyber risk to your investors and shareholders.
Yeah, great input, Chris. And, as these regulations have emerged over the last, 4 or 5 years, as onerous as they may be, the regulators have also allowed organizations to take a risk-based approach. And it is a conversation about risk, not the technology. Organizations understanding what their risk tolerance levels are and what are the appropriate level of controls that they need to put in there. A couple things to follow up on where Igor mentioned the policies and procedures that regulators look at, making sure that you have them and that they are implemented, and crossing that with your mention, Chris Hetner, on the SEC and bringing more talent into the groups that can have better sense of what should be in place, and then point the question really to Chris Bender and the blind spots. So you've done a lot of audits, Chris, especially ones that are regulatory focused, readiness, but also reactive, or, stuff has gone wrong. And you're seeing a trend where, regulators are looking at little different things and not going through so much of a cookie cutter approach. And organizations may have policies and procedures in place, but are they really effective? Are they hitting the requirements of what the regulators look for? Some people believe policies and procedures themselves may be the control, but where's like the enforcement of those controls? And so if you could share, just some thoughts in regards to, maybe at a high level, because that would be a little different view for some of the private equity firms, but then even those firms own companies that are going to be in more regulated environment, like banks that would have scrutiny at a higher level for the regulators.
Yeah, so with organizations that are fairly sophisticated in this space, one of the problems they get into is they have a certain framework that they operate under, and that's what they enforce, that's what they internally audit to, and that's what they check on, and their risk management functions are tied to those. The problem with that is sometimes there can be gaps in there, and you get a little bit of tunnel vision over what you're looking at and how that works. One of the areas, and I think, Mike, at the beginning of the session, you threw out a couple of names like SolarWinds and Kaseya and things of that sort. Things like supply chain risk and looking at your third and fourth parties and those types of things are areas that a lot of organizations with their vendor management functions and supplier risk management functions hadn't spent a whole lot of time and energy on, because it's things that you pass down to those other folks. And those are areas that demand attention. And one of the things is trying to constantly look at what you are looking at and understanding the current threat landscape and making sure that what you have in place covers all those different things. And that's not a one and done type of exercise. It's something that evolves. It's something that changes as you take on new markets, you work in different areas, you take on new technologies and different partners. And it's something that's a constant struggle is maybe the wrong word, but a constant area of focus that organizations need to have. And that's an area that we've seen with even some of the most robust organizations, even in the government sector, where they've found themselves in situations where there's certain things that they were just not paying attention to or focused on, and those are the areas that have gone on to bite them. And so that's an area where having some type of exercise where on some sort of regular basis you have some type of step back and you figure out what's really applicable to us and how does the threat landscape look for us today and what are the things that we need to be worried about. And that's when you bring on new types of functions, new technologies, things of that sort. And that's an area which has gotten a lot of attention that we've seen from an investment side of things, from an operational side of things, also from an insurance side of things, where people are looking at bringing in new things that really weren't covered in that space, and they're running into challenges when they're trying to collect on those types of things. So keeping an eye on what's really evolving internally and externally is critically important.
Right. I guess if you are a PE manager and you have 40, 50 portfolio companies, you would want some type of insight over what those firms are doing, maybe not deep down in the weeds, but like you mentioned, Igor, earlier, because there's going to be instances or incidents, I should say, that can happen at those portfolio companies that will not only affect the NAV, but may also have some requirements in regards to reporting issues, like you were mentioning before, correct? Oops, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, technology always gets you. So one of the principles of the federal securities laws is disclosure and disclosure of material facts. And a cybersecurity incident at a portfolio company would be a material fact that would need to be disclosed to investors. And especially if investors are inquiring about these kinds of issues, it would be important to have an incident response program and an incident response vendor on staff, on hand, to handle these kinds of situations. And at the end of the day, the cyber stuff, it's important and it's concerning. And one of the reasons for me it's especially concerning is because usually the regulation that's layered on top of cyber, it really you can almost get punched twice for the same thing. First, you have to deal with a real cyber incident, and then you have a regulator breathing down your neck. And in some ways, if you can get rid of at least that second risk, even if that first risk is really hard to get rid of, you can really advance your program and continue to focus on making investments rather than fighting fires.
Great. So another question back to Chris Bender, where we talk regulations, not only the SEC, where the management company of a PE firm would have to adhere to, but now you have the portfolio companies, and you may own companies that are in different sectors. One's in healthcare, one's in banking, somebody may be a DoD contractor, and have done some projects yourself working with the PE firm, and different PE firms will take more of a assistance approach with their portfolio companies than others. We're definitely seeing the trend where they want to help them more in these areas on the cyber. But from a PE manager perspective, what's good ways and things that you've helped them with get better visibility over those companies with not necessarily being intrusive?
Yep. So one of the big things that's real important there, and you kind of hit on it with just describing the difference in industries. There is a real difference between what you do and what your threat landscape looks like. If you are in the financial services space versus healthcare versus construction, certainly some of the same tactics apply, but the mechanisms and way in which you have vulnerabilities to those things really depend on how you operate, who your customers and markets you serve are, and those types of things that drive how you address them. And that's very important to have line of sight into it. And then that kind of drives as to how you provide assistance and support in that area. In many ways, it's having the ability to just understand current state and get your arms around everything that goes into protecting your assets and your systems and your data and those types of things. And that's very valuable. And by providing that view, it's helpful to the entity that's held, but also to the portfolio company, so they know a little bit more about what are the real operations that the folks have, what exposures that they have, and what do they have in place in order to mitigate anything bad from happening. And from there, you can look at how do you enhance and how do you build and how do you fill in the gaps in those pieces. But it's very important to have that view of what's really in play in a given set of operations based on their size, complexity, markets, things of that sort, as opposed to just using the abstract. And there's plenty of great abstracts and starting points for it. The real value is being able to take that and apply it and look at it from a real world standpoint. And that doesn't need to be very obtrusive. It's really just having a view on it and taking the time. And for any organization, having an independent view with that type of perspective is helpful. It's the same reason that people go to a doctor on an annual basis to have a checkup. There's a lot of basic things that we know they're going to say and they're going to tell you to do, and you kind of know it, but it's good to hear it. And the more you hear it and the more that you get things called out, gives you an opportunity to look at, are those things we need to prioritize? Are those things that we need to be creative about or do something about now, as opposed to just putting it on a list? And that's where the real value comes in there for both parties, to understand what needs to be done, where you really sit, and just make sure that you've got the right prioritization and balance of what you're doing to protect yourself.
Yeah, great. And so you used the term hear it, and to put Chris Hetner on the spot a little bit, which shouldn't be too hard because I know you talk to boards all the time. And a PE firm usually comes in if they're taking, a controlling interest in a company, if not less, but get some board representation. And oftentimes it may be the thoughts of, the IT person at the PE firm is going to be the one assisting and helping those companies, but it's really the partners that are on the deal team that have those seats on the boards. So if you were to go into a room of PE partners that are all on the deal team, sitting on the boards of these portfolio companies, what are some of the things you'd talk to them or would want them to hear, from a risk perspective, that would kind of raise their eyebrow to say, maybe we need to take a deeper look?
Yeah, it's a really great point, and it speaks to how we need to start contextualizing cyber risk to outcomes that are relevant to preserving value. And at the end of the day, the PE industry is about value creation. You take in a company, you work through the various financial elements, you build some muscle capacity, you improve the earnings in relationship to your costs, and now you have this efficient, lean type of company that eventually you'll exit. Last thing you need is some type of cyber event that would cause disruption or degrade the value of that asset as it exits. So the way I talk about the maintenance of that company in the portfolio is thinking about that 360 view. This isn't a one size fits all. There are companies that are in various verticals, different regulatory challenges, the threat landscape shifts, the downstream impact shifts. So if you're sitting on the board in these portfolio companies and you're driving value, you should be thinking about cyber as this kind of continuous assessment to ensure that you understand inherently where the risks are, and you're mapping scenarios that are material to that specific business, that particular company profile, that can cause material harm, such as intellectual property theft, a business interruption event. It could be a ransomware event, loss of customer data. And those types of events should be paired with the relative effectiveness of your defenses and your investments. So engage management. Do we have the right technology? Are we culturally aligned to ensure that we're aware that phishing attacks occur and our email systems are compromised? And then you start to extract where the particular exposures are that are most material to that particular business, that particular portfolio company, extrapolate where the potential material economic and business exposure should be. And that balance should give you some relative view as to where you need to make investments from a hygiene perspective. And ultimately, as you serve on the board, your job is to exercise a fiduciary responsibility to kind of oversee, advise on the overall strategy of the organization, of the company. And part of that strategy is going to be ensuring that you have some decision points on cyber risk exposure. How much of this risk are we willing to accept? How much of this can we transfer using an insurance policy? And then the balance is the efficacy of managing down that risk. And over time, you should ideally see a reduction in risk based on investments over time. Now, that may not always be the case to the extent that companies come together and they merge, or they may decide to outsource some capability to a higher risk type of country or region in the world. Your risk profile is going to shift, but at least having the finger on the pulse of the shifting landscape associated with these risk exposures gives you the ability to exercise your fiduciary responsibility and ensure that the management team is on point and aligned in protecting value.
Right. So, Igor, Chris mentioned risks quite a few times, and, when going in and doing a mock exam or so for a firm, or preparing them for an SEC exam that would come through, a lot of what is done initially has the firm self-identified their risks. And are you seeing, trends of firms, identifying more of their cyber risks? And if not, are, those the types of conversations that, you're engaging with on your clients about, as this is something that the regulators will be looking for, and at least get it out on the table and show that you are aware?
Yeah, I think other than the largest firms, most firms don't really have internal capability sufficient to identify their own cyber risks, much less the risks of their portfolio. And so from our vantage points, from what we see, is there's a lot of outsourcing of that particular function. One note on costs, obviously the costs of assessing a private equity firm's cybersecurity risks are going to be borne by that same firm, but the costs of assessing portfolio company cybersecurity risks are typically borne by either the funds or the portfolio companies. And I think for the most part, investors would welcome that kind of review, and I think that regulators will welcome that kind of review, and probably the portfolio companies themselves would welcome that kind of review, because again, cyber risks and cybersecurity incidents affect everyone negatively. And so thinking about that, and thinking about kind of the lack of resources required to do such an important analysis, I think is kind of something that should go into the mix when you're thinking about cybersecurity and how it might affect your firm broadly.
I think you just made probably, or answered one of the biggest questions that people would ask, is who's going to pay for it, right? When you go out and do it. Like you mentioned, some of the fund descriptions in the LP agreement will allow for these types of due diligence costs. In some cases, it's the portfolio company, and in some, the management company themselves has set out certain budget to cover these costs. Would that be about right, Igor?
No, I think for the most part, it's always the portfolio company that would pick up that cost, or the fund. I think every single fund is structured to allow due diligence costs to be paid for by investors.
That's perfect. Yeah, because I know, having conversations with firms, that was definitely a key part a few years back when this came on the radar for private equity firms and looking into it, is can the fund bear the cost? coming into actually a question that comes in here, actually towards a little bit more about dedicated resource or outside, came in from one of the investors, kind of following up on Igor's, and really tooling in regards to oversight of portfolio companies and managing risk. Chris Bender, I know you help with some implementations on these types of systems. Any just high-level guidance in regards to tooling and managing risk that organizations want to look at? I know there's a lot of off-the-shelf type solutions out there that, may look pretty, but might not get specific enough to an organization. There's also other ones that, could be expensive, more onerous than a firm needs. You've seen the gamut. Just kind of some thoughts if firms want to say, what can I use to help me get better visibility and stay on top of this?
Yeah, I think one of the big things to start with is to keep it simple and keep it relatively straightforward so people can actually use it and they understand what they're supposed to be doing with it. Sometimes the big flashy type of systems that spit out lots of different charts and graphics and that kind of stuff, it's more like just kind of painting by numbers and playing around with stuff to get a nice picture at the end. What you want to do is you want to find something that can be used in a way, and that's thinking about how you deploy it and how you get people to use it. Having people dialogue and having people work through and say, this is what we have, and these are some things that are factors that play into it, and this is how it works within our organization, and this is what it means to us and in our scenario. That's where you get the value out of this. And whatever tool you can get, because you certainly want to be able to document it, you want to make sure that you have some consistency in how information and data is collected across the organization, and then some way to pull it together and to measure it. And figuring out how you measure and what you're measuring is important. So something that gives you a little bit of flexibility. It's not a black box where you put some things in and poof, you get some findings out of it, but instead something where you can understand this is what is being put together, how it's being looked at, so you understand the mechanics and the inner workings of it, and then getting out of it something that says, okay, this is where we stand. These are the different things that we're looking at. This is how we can prioritize activity. This is how we can share information and coordinate and collaborate between different parts of the organization. Those are the things that are most important. So, just recapping that, it's making sure that there's something that's relatively straightforward, something that has consistency and captures things for you, something that you can understand and have line of sight as to how it's putting things together, so that when you get something out of it, you understand what it's looking at and how it's coming together with that. And that tends to be the most effective way to use tooling and use automation effectively. It helps you pull that stuff together, helps you organize it, helps you put it together, measure things without things being a black box or something where you have different things going in different places and some of them come out the other end and some of them seem to disappear or what have you. And that's where people get very frustrated with tooling, and some very sophisticated and well-meaning tools can sometimes be overtly complicated and not really give you much out of it. And if you're not getting value out of the output of it, you're going to stop using that tool.
So I think a question coming in parallel to your responses is addressing it, talking about measuring the progress really is the most important. You do the initial assessment, you get some insight on where the portfolio company stands. They need to make some improvements. Circling back, this asks kind of what are the is it a framework that you would follow for measuring? There's a lot of systems out there that report a score, an ABC letter, a number. What's the best metric for, maybe it's not a metric, right? Maybe it's a show of progression that you would just look at firms, so kind of a baseline and the next bar up.
What we find real useful is to, like, for any entity like a holding company or a PE firm, is to figure out what are the measures that matter to them. Is it looking at how people do in an independent assessment of things like the controls they have in place, and controls just for the definition of things that help people do something one way or make sure things don't happen a certain way. For progress on things that they commit to. We said we're going to do X, Y, and Z in this quarter. How many of those did you do? What's the actual accomplishment rate of those things? And there's a variety of things that you can have in there, and they don't all need to be overtly complicated, but you need to know what those are. And then with those measures in place, then you can figure out what kind of metrics make sense. So are we looking at things to be 100%? Are we looking at things that are some type of progress and not just being stagnant in an area? And you can use your own judgment calls on those. There are certainly a lot of different frameworks with that, and you can get really, really complicated very quickly. And those certainly give you a lot of starting points. Again, like you said earlier, Mike, a lot of that will depend on the type of industry you're in. Working with a bunch of software companies is different than working with fast food franchises. And it's different with dealing with different types of brick and mortar retailers versus online retailers. So having some sensitivity to the markets that you're dealing with and the infrastructure and the processes they have can be real important. But when it comes down to measuring progress, you're looking at what are the things that matter. Are you looking for measuring the effort? Are you looking at the results? And if you're looking at the results, having measures of how you quantify those results. You can get a result that doesn't provide a whole lot of value. You can have a result that provides a lot of value. And so you need to go through some of those. And so it's not always just grab a framework and run with it. It's grab a framework and figure out how does this work with the particular industries that we're dealing with the particular type of organizations and their operations, and applying it. I know that sounds like this is some real complicated tailored thing, but it's really not. It's really trying to just make sure that it's pragmatic so that you're getting something out of it that makes sense. And if you are trying to compare across different holding companies, thinking about how you want to do that in a way that is useful. You want to be careful with comparing apples to oranges, but you can look at your apples and your oranges and look at how the progress is being made with both of them. You just need to think about that and figure out what's something that's going to be useful that comes out of it. Because you certainly also don't want to get into a situation where you're getting executive status reports and dashboards that's giving you a false sense of either security or a false sense of alarm, because those tend to be very counterproductive very quickly. So you want to make sure you understand that. And it goes back to the earlier point of just making sure you understand what is driving some of those things. So you understand that if I see something is looking like it's positive or something that looks like it needs attention, that you can be confident in that, so you're taking the right type of action.
Excellent, excellent. I think you answered another question that was coming in the interim is, how much is enough of what to do? And I know every time I talk to a client about a new regulation, the first question that's always asked is, does it apply to me? Is there an exemption? Do I really have to do this? And we're coming up right about a quarter of, which is where we were going to start getting into a conclusion on it. So I'm going to maybe go around the horn and come back to you, Chris Hetner, maybe a little bit of a follow-up on what Chris Bender was just going through in regards to some measurement, some metrics, maybe the what is enough, and what also tied into what Igor mentioned in another question that was coming around, use of third parties in managing this, because often PE guys, they want to worry about adding value to the companies and not so much on the technical side. A lot of them use managed service providers, which is the people providing the plumbing, but may not necessarily be the best person to make sure that the plumbing is implemented correctly and the right controls are there. So I'll let you lead off with maybe some of the closing thoughts.
Yeah, and it's the level of due diligence and the risk is all relevant to the inherent risk profile of the company. So there's varying degrees of size, complexity, industry types that drive the risk tolerance level of that specific business profile. And ideally, the company understand where those risk thresholds are, whether it be a high, moderate, or low. What's the worst case scenario that can cause a material harm to that particular business? And there are two paradigms. There's one paradigm that talks about the what if scenario. What if we have a data breach or business interruption, a misappropriation of data, a ransomware event? Not all security breaches or cyber events are malicious in nature. In the lion's share of the matters that I was tending with while at the commission were just self-inflicted, poor change management controls that caused an outage. So it's kind of playing through those scenarios and then looking at your relative efficacy of controls and defenses wrapped around a security framework, such as the NIST CSF, NIST 800 series of various ranges of security frameworks. And what you ideally want to do is pair that maturity level relative to the reduction and treatment of that risk in financial terms. Now, it's not a trivial approach. I've seen some frameworks that use Monte Carlo simulations. Some frameworks are reliant on actual losses, but at least getting your head around that potential loss, probability of that loss, but more importantly, the pain point if this particular event would occur, it would cause a material impact on our business, on our value, start focusing on those types of assets. We've always heard protect the crown jewels. Where are the crown jewels? If an event were to occur, what's the level of pain? So you've got to be having that, creative thinking on what those potential outcomes could be, and then you start to zone in and prioritize your investments accordingly based on those particular event types.
That's great. You used the word materiality a few times, and I know, Igor, that's a word you use, especially, regulators kind of look at that. And it reminded me of a conversation I had 3 years ago with a pretty senior guy at a $25 billion PE fund. They own 52 portfolio companies, and I was trying to talk to him about the cyber risk, and the response was, 52 companies. If one of them implodes and goes to zero, it's not that big a risk. That's how we protect ourselves. And I kind of shook my head, and I know 3 years later, the company has taken a much different approach. They're looking at them. And I guess, Igor, it comes back to where you mentioned before, there's the pain maybe of the evaporation of 2% of the portfolio, but also then what the follow-up challenges could be from a regulator perspective. So I'll throw that in there, maybe as some thoughts towards your closing ideas, but welcome any others that you may have as well.
Yeah, certainly most of the cyber cases that we've seen are around incidents that go unreported or that go hidden. And you got to ask yourself, why are those incidents hidden? And it's because there's a real reputational impact of having a cyber breach at one of your portfolio companies. Obviously, hiding that cyber breach is not a good idea. Controlling that cyber breach when the costs are fairly low, that seems to be kind of the way to go. And the problem with kind of having 52 portfolio companies and continuing to grow is that the more portfolio companies you have, the more risk there is that there will be a cyber breach somewhere inside of your portfolio, that you'll have to spend a whole lot of time dealing with it. And that depending on what policies and procedures were in place, what kind of due diligence was done when that portfolio company was purchased, and what kind of ongoing due diligence was done by the manager, there could be a real reputational impact, and you could just end up looking bad. And in finance, obviously, reputation is what drives revenue, and having an impact there, a negative impact, is not a great thing.
No doubt on the reputation. I think you're forgiven better if you just make a bad investment call as opposed to a negligence somewhere that would cause a loss for the manager's reputation. Is definitely everything. So just coming a little past the quarter of, Mr. Bender, I'll throw to you if you have any closing comments you want to add.
Yeah, since one of the participants, Carl, called us on our false advertising that we haven't really talked about privacy, maybe I'll just chat about that for just a moment. An excellent point. And there are certain folks which will argue this a variety of different ways, but I've always looked at privacy as something on top of security. You need the security pieces in there in order to have the privacy elements, but privacy involves a whole other set of things, and a whole other set of things that work from your system development to your system operations to your complaint management to all sorts of other components with how you put your supplier and third-party controls in place. And privacy has been a hot topic in the state of California with CCPA, CPRA, with GDPR, with the Brazilian law, also with, I think there's about 9 states that have various pieces of legislation that are in very decent likelihood of passing in some way, shape, or form within those states. And just the fact that we use the internet to connect with folks, and so you got people across jurisdictions and arguing as to where they actually are or aren't, is a lot of things there. Privacy, like I think Igor mentioned, is the notion of dealing with some of these things. It's something that is doable, like you have on the cyber side, and you might as well do some of these things. So tying together some of those privacy elements, which really gets into not just the protection of the data from some type of exposure and availability or the integrity of it, but also considering what data it is and who can see it and what can they do with it, even when it's in those protected modes. And then certainly if it's ever exposed, how you deal with it differently there, with everything from notifications and dealing with how you remedy those types of situations. It's a whole other set of planning and set of actions that need to be looked at. As with security, if you think about those things proactively and you think of them part of the infrastructure and the things that you're doing and you incorporate them by design, it's a lot easier to put them in place. It's a lot easier to operationalize and institutionalize them, and you get much more value out of it. Because again, let's think about that data that we're talking about with privacy data. That's data that's valuable. There's a reason that outside entities want to get a hold of it. It's valuable, though, to companies. And those are their customers. Those are their partners. Those are the way that they make revenue for their businesses. So thinking about that and thinking about your customer relationship management and how you deal with that data it can be very valuable. So putting those pieces together and tying in the privacy piece, one, can be very smart from keeping you out of trouble from a regulatory standpoint, but also a civil action type of standpoint, and also part of your mitigation of risks if you ever do have something like a breach or exposure of your data, making sure that you can control it and work through that properly. So again, we probably did not do privacy as full justice in the conversation today, but certainly there's a lot that could have been covered and things of that sort, but we can certainly take it on. But excellent points on the privacy elements and what goes on differently there. And although when I was going through my laws, I didn't mention the GLBA stuff, but the GLBA privacy rule and how that relates, especially in the financial space, is also very important to take into effect. So again, a lot of different considerations coming into here, and privacy is a very important element.
Absolutely. I think we could do a whole session just on privacy, and the PE management companies might not have as big an exposure because they might not have a high PII, but definitely the portfolio companies will have a lot of exposure. If it's a tech company that's leveraging on some marketing or has some application developers that are working with test data and not making sure it's anonymized and appropriately wrapped around compliance controls, can really run into a lot of problems. You look at GDPR that was implemented 3 years ago, and look at all the companies' websites now that used to have just 2 sentences for their privacy policy, and now it's 4 or 5 pages all around the use of data, how it's shared. That was the cycle, as I talked about in the beginning, of emerging regulations. Now comes the enforcement cycle. Amazon was hit with GDPR fine over $800 million 6-7 weeks ago. Will they pay the full amount? Not sure. CCPA in California, similar to GDPR, has put in the regulations that they will have to fund some of the initiatives for the regulations through fines and penalties. And privacy is, like Chris said, very dependent on security. We'll have similar requirements from breach reporting. That is a lot of the components of the new regulations, but also the rights of the user and their data. And privacy not only is going to be important, but it's also going to be a competitive advantage for firms. Apple with the padlock, advertising privacy. And that's something that affects everybody, affects every consumer, and maybe not necessarily driven directly from a regulatory body, but like I said, the rights of the consumer and the ownership of their data. So Chris, like I said, I think you teed up the next topic and webinar that we could go into a lot further with privacy, but appreciate all 3 of you joining me today. I know Mr. Hetner had to drop off for another engagement, but Igor and Chris, really appreciate the value. Appreciate everybody that's joined us today for this session. There will be replays made available, and look forward to any follow-up questions that you'd like to send across our way. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Great. Have a good day.
This concludes today's webinar.